In the years after Germany's defeat in the First World War, a quiet, disciplined officer named Erich Raeder watched his country's navy disappear piece by piece. The Treaty of Versailles had dismantled the proud imperial fleet he had once served in, leaving only a handful of outdated cruisers and coast defense ships. Yet in Raeder's mind, the dream of a powerful German sea force never died. While politicians in Berlin argued over reparations and domestic crises, Raeder studied the naval powers that still ruled the world: the Royal Navy of Britain and the rapidly modernizing fleets of Japan and the United States. He understood that a future war, if it ever came, would not only be fought on land and in the air, but would hinge on control of sea lanes and the ability to choke or sustain economies through maritime power. Through the 1920s, he advanced cautiously within the small, constrained Kriegsmarine, earning a reputation as a loyal professional rather than a political opportunist. He kept his distance from the noisy ideologies that consumed Weimar Germany, concentrating instead on training and doctrine. His meticulous notes, later found in post-war archives, reveal an officer obsessed with two ideas. First, that Germany must never again allow its sea power to wither. And second, that any new German navy must avoid the strategic mistakes of 1914 to 1918. In those years, the Kaiser's fleet had stayed bottled up for most of the war, unable to challenge the British blockade. Raeder believed a future navy would need to strike far and fast, reaching beyond Europe's coasts into the Atlantic itself. When the Nazis rose to power in 1933, Raeder was already chief of naval command. Unlike some of his army counterparts, he viewed Hitler cautiously but pragmatically. The new regime promised rearmament and the restoration of German pride. And for a professional sailor who had spent a decade maintaining obsolete ships, this was an irresistible opportunity. Hitler, meanwhile, found in Raeder the image of an old-school officer, disciplined, non-political, and outwardly loyal. Their early meetings were formal and polite, though neither fully trusted the other. Raeder saw Hitler as reckless, Hitler saw Raeder as overly conservative. But both understood that they needed each other. By 1934, the Kriegsmarine began to shed its restrictions under the guise of training exercises and coastal modernization. New designs were drawn for larger warships, and naval architects quietly experimented with armor and propulsion systems that would later appear on the famous pocket battleships, the Deutschland, Admiral Scheer, and Admiral Graf Spee. These vessels, small enough to fit within treaty limits but powerful enough to outgun most cruisers, embodied Raeder's philosophy: commerce raiders that could operate alone across vast distances. They were the seeds of the navy he envisioned. In 1935, Hitler shocked the world by signing the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which formally allowed Germany to build a fleet up to 35% the size of Britain's surface navy. For Raeder, this was a strategic masterstroke. It legitimized rearmament, divided potential enemies, and gave him the breathing room to expand shipbuilding under an international facade of legality. He knew Britain still ruled the seas, but he believed the agreement was a temporary convenience. Sooner or later, the two nations would be adversaries again. Behind closed doors, Raeder and his planners drafted what would become known as the Z Plan, a massive blueprint for a balanced ocean-going fleet to be completed by 1948. The plan envisioned 10 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, a dozen cruisers, and hundreds of destroyers and submarines. It was audacious, almost fantastical for a country that only a decade earlier had been forbidden to own heavy warships. But Raeder saw it as Germany's only chance to challenge Britain's maritime empire on equal terms. In memos, he emphasized that a continental army, no matter how strong, could not win a long war if its trade routes were strangled and its imports cut off. Germany must become a global power, and a global power required a navy. Hitler's enthusiasm for the Z plan was fickle. He liked grand projects and admired the symbolism of mighty battleships, yet he never grasped the strategic patience such a fleet required. Raeder tried to educate him with charts, timelines, and comparisons of tonnage, but the Führer's attention drifted toward the Army and Air Force, the tools of rapid conquest. Even so, construction began on the first Bismarck-class battleships, and propaganda films proudly displayed steel hulls rising in Hamburg and Kiel. Ordinary Germans saw them as proof that their nation was back among the great powers. Within the Navy itself, however, there was unease. Younger officers, such as Karl Dönitz, commander of the growing submarine arm, argued that Germany could never match Britain ship by ship. Instead, Dönitz proposed a new kind of sea war, one fought beneath the waves, using packs of U-boats to hunt merchant convoys. He calculated that with 300 submarines, Germany could starve Britain into submission. Raeder respected Dönitz, but regarded submarines as auxiliary weapons. He envisioned a fleet that could project prestige as well as destruction, believing that great nations were judged by their battleships, not by their undersea raiders. This philosophical divide between the surface fleet and the U-boat arm would shape the Kriegsmarine's destiny. By 1938, the Z plan had entered its most ambitious phase. Germany's shipyards buzzed with workers, resources were diverted from civilian industries, and engineers struggled to design carriers capable of launching modern aircraft. The Navy's budget swelled to unprecedented levels, second only to the Luftwaffe. But beneath the optimism lay an unavoidable reality. The fleet would not be ready for a decade. When the Sudeten crisis erupted that autumn, Raeder realized with alarm that Hitler might plunge Europe into war before his navy was complete. He confided to his staff that a conflict before 1945 would be catastrophic for the sea service. As 1939 dawned, the storm clouds gathered faster than anyone expected. Hitler's eye turned eastward toward Poland, and military planning accelerated under the code name Fall Weiss. Raeder requested an audience to explain the naval implications. If Germany attacked Poland, he warned, Britain and France would inevitably respond. The Kriegsmarine, with only a handful of heavy ships and about 50 operational submarines, could not withstand the Royal Navy's blockade. His private diary entry from early 1939 captures the moment. Our fleet is in its infancy. We are to be forced into a war for which we are not prepared. The Führer believes England will not intervene. I fear he is mistaken. Hitler summoned Raeder to the Reich Chancellery in August 1939 for a final briefing on the coming invasion. Maps of the Baltic lay across the table, marked with red and blue arrows. Raeder presented the Navy's twin operational plans, one for Poland in the Baltic and another contingency for Britain and France in the Atlantic. He spoke methodically, outlining how German forces would blockade the Polish coast, mine the approaches to Gdynia, and prevent the escape of the Polish destroyer squadron. Then he turned to the Atlantic. Surface raiders and submarines would target Allied shipping if war spread westward. He emphasized that Germany's surface fleet was small, but could inflict economic damage through swift, unpredictable strikes. Hitler listened impatiently. To him, the war against Poland would be over in weeks. He doubted Britain or France would act decisively. Raeder pressed his case, but the Führer waved aside concerns. He said, "Our enemies will protest, not fight." The meeting ended abruptly, leaving the Admiral deeply uneasy. As he left the Chancellery, he remarked to a colleague, "We are sailing blind into a storm." On September 1, 1939, the invasion began. German naval units mined the Polish coast, supported the army's advance, and hunted the small Polish fleet. Within days, control of the Baltic was secure. Yet in the wider war that Raeder had dreaded had come to pass. Britain and France declared war on Germany, transforming a regional conflict into a world war. The Kriegsmarine's great fleet was on the drawing board, its keels barely laid. Now its officers faced the most powerful maritime alliance on Earth, with a fraction of its strength. Under the gray autumn skies of 1939, the Baltic became the first testing ground for the new German Navy. As winter of 1939-1940 settled over northern Europe, the Kriegsmarine faced the dual challenges of extreme weather and an increasingly alert enemy. Raeder knew that the cold months were both a hindrance and an opportunity. The icy waters of the North Sea made naval maneuvers treacherous, yet the long nights offered cover for submarine operations. Donitz seized on this, deploying wolfpacks to patrol the western approaches, laying ambushes against merchant convoys attempting to bring vital supplies to Britain. Each sinking was a minor victory, yet Raeder was acutely aware that success came at a cost. The Atlantic was vast, and the Allies were learning quickly. Every U-boat lost was a blow that Germany could ill afford, given the slow production rates and limited training capacity. During this period, Raeder's attention also returned to the Baltic. While the immediate Polish threat had been neutralized, the Baltic Sea remained a critical strategic corridor. He oversaw exercises to ensure that minefields were secure and that German coastal artillery could repel any attempt at Allied or neutral interference. Intelligence reports suggested that Britain might attempt small-scale raids or reconnaissance missions in the northern waters, and Raeder meticulously prepared countermeasures. Despite the calm imposed by the Polish collapse, he knew that the war had only just begun and that control of the Baltic would provide essential support for subsequent operations elsewhere. The German surface fleet, constrained by the lack of aircraft carriers and the relative weakness of its cruisers against the Royal Navy, had to adapt. Raeder encouraged the deployment of his pocket battleships, emphasizing mobility and surprise. Ships like the Deutschland and Admiral Scheer were dispatched on long-range missions into the Atlantic, preying upon unescorted Allied merchant ships. These operations were meticulously planned to minimize exposure to superior enemy forces. The successes of these raiders provided propaganda victories, and Raeder frequently highlighted their achievements in reports to Hitler, stressing that even a limited fleet could exert influence far beyond the North Sea and Baltic. Despite these efforts, the political situation in Germany placed increasing strain on Raeder. Hitler's ambitions extended beyond Europe's northern waters, and the Führer's attention was turning toward Denmark and Norway. Securing these nations was essential not only for strategic positioning, but also for safeguarding shipments of Swedish iron ore critical to German industry. Raeder initially opposed these operations, citing the risk of overextending his already limited forces. Nevertheless, he eventually accepted the mission, recognizing that the potential strategic gains outweighed the immediate dangers. The planning for Operation Weserübung, the simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway, was complex and ambitious. Raeder coordinated closely with the Luftwaffe and the Army, ensuring that German naval forces could deliver troops, secure ports, and protect supply lines. The operation required navigating minefields, coordinating landings in multiple locations, and anticipating the response of the British Royal Navy. Raeder's meticulous preparation was a testament to his understanding of naval warfare as both a science and an art. The Norwegian campaign began on April 9, 1940. German ships moved under the cover of darkness, and initial landings achieved their objectives with surprising speed. Copenhagen fell almost immediately, while coastal cities in Norway were taken by coordinated assaults from sea and air. Yet the cost was significant. Several destroyers and light cruisers were sunk during engagements with British forces, including the destruction of the heavy cruiser Blücher in the Oslo Fjord. Raeder, observing the operation's progress from Berlin, noted both the successes and the losses. While the campaign secured vital positions, it had further weakened the surface fleet that he had so carefully nurtured. Following the capture of Norway, Raeder turned his attention back to the Atlantic, recognizing that Germany's survival depended on disrupting British supply lines. U-boats intensified their patrols, operating in increasingly coordinated wolfpacks. Raeder monitored these operations closely, aware that each sinking had a psychological as well as strategic impact. Convoys were increasingly vulnerable, and merchant crews lived under constant threat. British naval commands scrambled to adapt, deploying escorts, convoys, and air patrols, but the lessons of the early months were clear. The Kriegsmarine, though smaller, could still project fear across the Atlantic. By mid-1940, Raeder's situation grew increasingly precarious. Hitler's eyes turned toward France and the Low Countries, demanding naval support for operations that required transporting troops, coordinating air cover, and protecting supply lines. Raeder advised caution, emphasizing the limitations of his fleet and the dangers of overextension. Hitler, confident in the speed of the army's advances and the supposed inefficiency of the Royal Navy, dismissed these warnings. The tension between strategic reality and political ambition became a defining feature of Raeder's command. During this period, Raeder also faced internal challenges. The growing influence of Donitz and the U-boat arm created tension in the naval command structure. While Raeder valued Donitz's aggressive tactics, he remained committed to a vision of a balanced fleet capable of both surface engagement and submarine warfare. The disparity between the two approaches would become more pronounced in the months ahead, particularly as technological advancements and intelligence breakthroughs began to favor the Allies. By the summer of 1940, the Kriegsmarine's Atlantic operations had achieved notable successes, but at a cost. The British developed new anti-submarine tactics, convoy systems, and radar detection methods that gradually reduced U-boat effectiveness. Raeder understood that innovation and adaptation were critical. He commissioned studies on radar countermeasures, convoy interception strategies, and advanced torpedo design. These initiatives demonstrated his foresight even as the strategic situation became increasingly constrained by the overwhelming size of the Royal Navy. The successes in Norway and the early months of Atlantic raiding established Raeder's reputation as a meticulous and resourceful admiral. Yet they also highlighted the central tension of his career. Germany's navy was being asked to achieve disproportionate objectives with limited resources. Raeder's writings during this period, preserved in post-war archives, reveal his constant balancing act between ambition and reality, between political expectation and operational capability. The winter of 1940-41 brought further challenges. The German occupation of Norway and Denmark required constant logistical support, stretching Raeder's already limited forces. Ice and storms complicated naval movements, and supply lines were vulnerable to British interdiction. Meanwhile, Hitler's continued obsession with rapid conquest left little room for long-term naval preparation. Raeder's repeated warnings about the incomplete state of the fleet went unheeded. His private memos expressed frustration and foreboding, predicting that a premature confrontation with Britain could have catastrophic consequences. Despite these constraints, the Kriegsmarine continued to innovate. Raeder oversaw the development of improved naval artillery, enhanced submarine communications, and advanced reconnaissance protocols. Training exercises became increasingly sophisticated, emphasizing coordination between surface ships, submarines, and aircraft. Raeder's vision of a modern, flexible navy persisted, even as immediate circumstances forced compromises. By the spring of 1941, the strategic situation had reached a critical juncture. Hitler's attention was turning toward the Soviet Union, and the naval war against Britain demanded ever greater resources. Raeder's fleet remained a shadow of the Z-Plan's original vision, yet it continued to exert pressure on Allied supply lines and provide critical support for German operations in Northern Europe. The stage was set for the next phase of conflict, in which Raeder's careful planning, Donitz's aggressive submarine tactics, and the limitations imposed by political decisions would converge in a struggle that would define the Kriegsmarine's role in World War II. As spring 1941 approached, the Kriegsmarine found itself at a crossroads. Raeder, still commanding with the meticulous precision that had defined his career, realized that the surface fleet could not alone alter the strategic balance. The Atlantic remained a theater of both opportunity and danger. Raeder's reliance on U-boats was no longer optional, it was a necessity. Donitz's wolfpacks had begun to demonstrate a deadly efficiency, attacking convoys in coordinated strikes that exploited gaps in Allied escort coverage. Yet even these successes were fragile. Each U-boat lost represented a significant investment in both material and trained personnel, and replacement rates could never match the pace of attrition. The strategic situation was further complicated by Germany's planned invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's obsession with a rapid, decisive victory in the East placed additional pressure on Raeder. Resources, particularly steel and fuel, were diverted toward the Army and Luftwaffe. Shipyards, already stretched, struggled to maintain production schedules for both new surface ships and additional submarines. Raeder's Z plan, which envisioned a balanced fleet capable of global reach by 1948, had been permanently truncated. The Admiral adapted by focusing on immediate utility. The surface fleet would be used for targeted operations, while submarines became the primary instrument of strategic warfare. The spring months saw renewed U-boat activity in the North Atlantic. Convoys en route to Britain faced unprecedented risks. Dönitz had refined his tactics, coordinating multiple U-boats to converge on targets simultaneously. Raeder monitored these campaigns with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal concern. The effectiveness of the wolfpacks was undeniable, yet he understood that technological advancements by the Allies, airborne radar, sonar detection, and the increasing use of long-range aircraft would eventually blunt the advantage of undersea warfare. In his private correspondence, he lamented that Germany was fighting a high-stakes game with too few pieces on the board. The surface fleet, meanwhile, remained constrained by operational realities. The loss of the Graf Spee in December 1939 and the limitations of the pocket battleships had taught Raeder that single-ship raiding, while daring, could not replace fleet strength. He dispatched his remaining cruisers on missions designed to disrupt shipping lanes, but these operations were increasingly perilous. British naval forces, learning from prior encounters, began to establish more effective patrols and escort convoys. The risk of losing additional capital ships weighed heavily on Raeder's mind. In parallel with operational planning, Raeder devoted considerable attention to logistics and training. He oversaw the expansion of naval bases in occupied Norway, ensuring that submarines could operate from secure harbors close to the North Atlantic. He implemented advanced training programs for crew members, emphasizing coordination between surface ships and submarines. These preparations were critical not only for immediate operational success, but also for maintaining morale among the officers and sailors who understood that they were facing the most powerful maritime adversary in history. The summer of 1941 brought new developments. Hitler's decision to launch Operation Barbarossa in June shifted the focus of the war to the Eastern Front. While the army advanced deep into Soviet territory, Raeder's navy continued to fight a quieter but no less critical war at sea. The U-boats intensified attacks against Allied convoys, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping. Raeder's role was largely supervisory, coordinating fleet movements, authorizing operations, and managing the increasingly complex logistics of long-range submarine warfare. Despite these successes, challenges mounted. The Allies began implementing convoy systems with stronger escorts, air cover, and improved detection equipment that reduced the effectiveness of wolfpack tactics. Raeder realized that the naval war was evolving into a prolonged contest of attrition and innovation. The next months would test not only the tactical skill of commanders and crews, but also the adaptability of Germany's strategic planners. In addition to operational concerns, Raeder faced internal challenges within the Kriegsmarine. The growing prominence of the U-boat arm created friction between traditional surface fleet officers and the submarine command. Raeder, while supportive of Dönitz's successes, remained committed to a balanced navy. He feared that over-reliance on submarines would leave Germany vulnerable in other theaters and diminish the prestige of the Navy. These internal debates were often intense, reflecting broader questions about doctrine, resource allocation, and the future of naval warfare. Despite these tensions, Raeder continued to emphasize innovation and strategic foresight. He pushed for the development of new technologies, including more advanced torpedoes, improved communication systems, and enhanced reconnaissance capabilities. Training programs were updated to reflect changing operational realities, with a focus on coordination between different branches of the Navy and integration with air and land forces. Raeder's leadership style, methodical and detail-oriented, ensured that even under pressure, the Kriegsmarine maintained a high degree of operational competence. The winter of 1941-1942 brought harsh conditions and new operational challenges. The Atlantic was fraught with storms, ice, and long nights that complicated navigation and supply. Nevertheless, the U-boats continued to operate effectively, and Raeder monitored their campaigns with careful attention. Each sinking of an Allied vessel was both a tactical victory and a strategic message. Germany, though numbered up to, could still project power across the world's oceans. Yet Raeder remained acutely aware that the strategic situation was precarious. The industrial capacity of the Allies, particularly the United States, loomed as an inevitable threat that Germany's limited navy could not match. As the year progressed, Raeder's focus shifted increasingly towards preparation for larger-scale operations, both defensive and offensive. He worked to ensure that ports, supply lines, and repair facilities in Norway and Northern Europe were optimized for long-term operations. Coordination with the Luftwaffe became increasingly important, as air reconnaissance and support could extend the reach of both submarines and surface vessels. Raeder's methodical attention to detail, combined with his understanding of the broader strategic context, allowed the Kriegsmarine to punch above its weight in a conflict dominated by larger naval powers. By early 1942, the stage was set for a new phase of the naval war. The Kriegsmarine, though constrained by numbers and resources, had established a formidable presence in the Atlantic and maintained control over the Baltic and northern waters. Raeder's vision of a flexible, multifaceted navy, though truncated from the original Z plan, remained operational. The coming months would see intensified engagements with Allied forces, the continued evolution of submarine warfare, and the increasing pressures of coordinating operations across multiple theaters. The outcome of these efforts would shape not only the future of the Kriegsmarine, but also the broader trajectory of the war itself. By the spring of 1942, the Kriegsmarine had adapted to the relentless pressures of a war conducted on multiple fronts. Raeder's careful planning, coupled with Dönitz's aggressive wolfpack tactics, had secured temporary dominance over key sections of the Atlantic shipping lanes. Yet the larger strategic picture remained troubling. The Allies were now mobilizing with unprecedented industrial and technological power. American shipyards were producing Liberty ships at a rate that dwarfed anything Germany could counter. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force were improving convoy protection, and radar technology was steadily eroding the tactical advantages that had allowed U-boats to strike with relative impunity. Raeder remained acutely aware of these threats. In private correspondence and staff reports, he emphasized the need for innovation, coordination, and careful risk management. Every decision had to balance the limited resources of the Kriegsmarine with the ambitious demands of Hitler's strategic vision. The Admiral's approach was methodical. While his subordinates occasionally criticized his caution, Raeder's judgment was informed by decades of experience and a nuanced understanding of both the operational and political dimensions of naval warfare. The surface fleet, by contrast, had been relegated to secondary operations. With the loss of major capital ships and the threat posed by superior Allied forces, Raeder's cruisers and remaining battleships were used primarily for convoy interception, coastal defense, and diversionary raids. These operations, while important, could not produce decisive outcomes on their own. Raeder often reflected on the contrast between his original Z plan and the constrained reality of 1942. The ambitious vision of a balanced fleet capable of global influence had been replaced with a pragmatic focus on survival, opportunistic engagement, and support for broader strategic objectives. Despite these limitations, the Kriegsmarine achieved notable successes in the Atlantic. U-boat commanders executed increasingly sophisticated operations, coordinating attacks across vast distances and exploiting weaknesses in convoy formations. Raeder followed these operations closely, often consulting with Donitz to refine tactics and improve communications. The wolfpack strategy, combined with careful intelligence gathering and reconnaissance, allowed Germany to maintain a measure of control over the seas even as Allied countermeasures improved. The Norwegian bases proved invaluable during this period. Raeder ensured that repair facilities, fuel depots, and supply chains were optimized to support long-range operations. Submarines could now operate from ports closer to the Atlantic, reducing transit times and increasing operational effectiveness. Raeder personally inspected key installations, emphasizing efficiency, discipline, and readiness. His leadership instilled confidence among officers and crew even as the strategic situation grew increasingly precarious. By mid-1942, the Allies had begun implementing more effective convoy escort tactics, combining surface ships, aircraft, and improved detection technologies. The Kriegsmarine faced increasing losses, and Raeder recognized that sustaining pressure on the Atlantic lanes would require both innovation and careful resource management. He authorized experiments with new torpedo designs, refined wolfpack coordination, and improved communications protocols. Every incremental advance was critical, as Germany could not afford mistakes in a theater where numerical inferiority was a constant challenge. In addition to operational concerns, Raeder contended with political pressures. Hitler remained focused on rapid, spectacular victories on land, often underestimating the complexity and difficulty of naval warfare. Raeder frequently found himself defending cautious strategies, emphasizing the risks of overextension and the limits of available resources. These discussions were tense and sometimes acrimonious, but Raeder's authority and professional credibility generally allowed him to maintain operational control. Nevertheless, he understood that political impatience could undermine even the most carefully laid plans. The winter of 1942-1943 was particularly challenging. Weather conditions in the North Atlantic and Baltic were severe, with storms, ice, and darkness complicating navigation and operations. Yet U-boat campaigns continued, albeit with mounting difficulty. Raeder monitored each engagement, studying reports of losses, successes, and enemy adaptations. The data revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the Kriegsmarine. He recognized that future operations would demand not only tactical skill, but also strategic innovation, technological adaptation, and careful allocation of scarce resources. By the spring of 1943, Raeder's position was increasingly precarious. His surface fleet remained limited, the U-boat arm was under constant pressure, and Hitler's expectations continued to strain operational realities. In Berlin, Raeder drafted a series of memorandum outlining the strategic challenges facing the Navy, emphasizing the importance of prioritizing submarine warfare while preserving the remaining surface units for critical missions. He also advocated for accelerated technological development, including radar countermeasures, improved torpedoes, and more effective anti-aircraft defenses. The challenges of coordination across multiple theaters became apparent as well. Norway, the North Sea, and the Atlantic each presented unique operational demands. Raeder worked tirelessly to synchronize efforts, often personally overseeing the movement of convoys, the deployment of wolfpacks, and the positioning of surface ships.
His attention to detail and insistence on operational discipline helped maintain a coherent strategy even as external pressures mounted. By mid-1943, the strategic situation had begun to turn against Germany. Allied technological and industrial advantages were becoming increasingly apparent. The Kriegsmarine faced increasing losses in both surface ships and submarines, while the Allies enhanced convoy protection and expanded long-range air patrols. Raeder's warnings about the limitations of Germany's naval capacity had been largely ignored in the early years, and now the consequences were clear. Yet he continued to focus on achievable objectives, emphasizing tactical precision, coordination, and the judicious use of resources. Despite these challenges, Raeder's leadership ensured that the Kriegsmarine remained a credible threat. Submarines continued to harass Allied shipping, surface raiders carried out selective missions, and coastal defenses in occupied territories remained secure. Raeder's emphasis on training, innovation, and operational discipline allowed the Navy to maintain effectiveness under difficult conditions. His personal commitment to strategy, preparation, and the welfare of his crews remained unwavering, even as the strategic landscape shifted against Germany.
By late 1943, the Kriegsmarine's strategic situation had become increasingly strained. Raeder's warnings from previous years that Germany could not sustain a prolonged naval conflict against numerically superior Allied forces had proven prescient. The U-boat arm, while still capable of striking convoys, was encountering increasingly sophisticated Allied countermeasures, including long-range patrol aircraft, improved sonar, and escort carriers that provided air cover across previously exposed sections of the Atlantic. Losses among U-boats were mounting, and the attrition of experienced crews posed a serious challenge to operational effectiveness. Raeder's meticulous planning and operational foresight were now tested under the harshest conditions. He implemented a series of operational adjustments aimed at maximizing the impact of remaining forces while minimizing unnecessary risk. Wolfpack tactics were refined, patrol routes were altered to exploit gaps in Allied defenses, and coordination with Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes was intensified. Raeder's emphasis on intelligence and adaptability allowed the Kriegsmarine to continue exerting pressure on Allied shipping, even as technological and numerical disadvantages became more acute. The surface fleet, meanwhile, had been largely relegated to defensive roles in the North Sea and Norwegian waters. Raeder had long recognized that engaging the Royal Navy directly with the limited surface units at his disposal would be catastrophic. Instead, he focused on protecting vital supply lines, supporting coastal operations, and maintaining the operational readiness of the remaining capital ships. Despite these constraints, occasional raiding operations were carried out, demonstrating Germany's capacity for bold action when conditions allowed. The interplay between political demands and operational realities remained a constant challenge. Hitler, increasingly obsessed with spectacular victories on the Eastern Front and in the air war against Britain, often pressured Raeder for immediate results. The Admiral's measured responses emphasized the limitations of his forces and the strategic necessity of caution. While this occasionally caused friction with Hitler and other political leaders, Raeder's expertise and credibility ensured that his assessments were generally respected. Nonetheless, the pressure to achieve dramatic results weighed heavily on him and his staff. Raeder also faced internal tensions within the Navy. The prominence of the U-boat arm, under the command of Karl Donitz, created both operational success and institutional friction. Traditional surface fleet officers occasionally criticized the emphasis on submarines, arguing that the balance of naval power required a more diversified approach. Raeder, while supportive of Donitz's achievements, remained committed to maintaining a flexible and balanced Navy, recognizing that the long-term survival of Germany's naval forces depended on adaptability across multiple theaters and operational modalities. The logistical challenges of sustaining operations in distant waters became increasingly complex. Norway remained a critical base for Atlantic operations, but the supply lines were vulnerable to Allied interdiction and harsh winter conditions. Raeder invested significant effort in optimizing port facilities, ensuring the availability of fuel and repair resources, and coordinating the movement of personnel and materiel. His attention to operational detail reflected a deep understanding of the intricate demands of maritime warfare and the importance of maintaining readiness under adverse conditions. By early 1944, the strategic situation had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. U-boat losses were mounting, Allied air patrols were increasingly effective, and technological innovations such as improved radar, sonar, and code-breaking threatened the core of German naval operations. Raeder's warnings from the early years of the war had proven accurate. The Kriegsmarine, despite skill and innovation, was facing overwhelming industrial and technological opposition. Yet even under these circumstances, Raeder sought to preserve the operational effectiveness of his forces, emphasizing coordination, careful planning, and judicious engagement. The Atlantic campaign remained central to Germany's strategic objectives. Raeder continued to oversee U-boat operations with meticulous attention, coordinating wolfpack attacks, monitoring convoy movements, and implementing tactical adaptations in response to evolving Allied defenses. Each engagement was scrutinized for lessons learned, and operational protocols were adjusted to maximize efficiency. The interplay between strategy, tactics, and technology became increasingly critical as the Kriegsmarine sought to maintain relevance in a conflict dominated by larger, better-resourced forces. Raeder's personal leadership style was characterized by attention to detail, operational discipline, and an emphasis on preparation. He personally reviewed reports from commanders, examined tactical outcomes, and provided guidance on strategic adjustments. His focus on training, readiness, and coordination allowed the Kriegsmarine to maintain operational competence even as external pressures mounted and the strategic situation deteriorated. As 1944 progressed, the challenges intensified. Allied naval and air superiority became increasingly evident, and the Kriegsmarine's capacity to influence the broader course of the war was limited. Raeder's efforts shifted towards mitigation and strategic preservation, minimizing losses, sustaining morale, and ensuring that the remaining forces could continue to exert pressure where feasible. He emphasized operational prudence, careful allocation of resources, and the use of intelligence to guide tactical decision-making. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought the final stages of the Kriegsmarine struggle in the Atlantic. U-boat operations continued, but Allied technological advantages had eroded their effectiveness. Surface units remained primarily in defensive positions, guarding key ports and supply lines. Raeder's strategic focus was now on ensuring that the Navy could continue to function in support of Germany's overall war effort, despite the increasingly hopeless tactical situation. Throughout this period, Raeder's correspondence and war diaries reveal a consistent theme: the tension between political expectation and operational reality. Hitler demanded results, often without understanding the limitations imposed by technology, industrial capacity, and enemy adaptation. Raeder's careful, professional approach sought to reconcile these demands with the practical necessities of maritime warfare. His efforts maintained the operational integrity of the Kriegsmarine, even as Germany's broader strategic position became increasingly precarious. By mid-1945, the Kriegsmarine was effectively confined to port with limited operational capacity
and dwindling resources. The Atlantic had long since been dominated by Allied forces, and Raeder's carefully cultivated strategies of coordination, innovation, and adaptation could no longer influence the outcome. Yet his leadership throughout the conflict ensured that the Kriegsmarine remained a competent and professional force to the very end. His focus on discipline, preparation, and operational analysis allowed Germany's Navy to achieve remarkable successes, despite being consistently outnumbered and outmatched.
As the war progressed into the spring of 1945, the Kriegsmarine faced the final stages of its operational existence. Raeder, now acutely aware of the broader collapse of Germany's military position, concentrated on preserving what remained of his forces while maintaining professional discipline and morale. Ports in Norway and northern Germany were still holding some operational ships, but Allied bombing campaigns, fuel shortages, and the advancing Soviet and Western armies severely limited mobility. Raeder's attention shifted to ensuring that his remaining assets could provide support in coastal defense and evacuation operations, as the possibility of a decisive naval engagement had all but vanished. Even in these final months, Raeder maintained his characteristic meticulous planning. Submarine operations, though greatly diminished, continued in the Baltic, focusing on limited interdiction and reconnaissance missions. The remaining U-boats were ordered to harass advancing Allied forces and protect vital evacuation routes. Coordination with the Luftwaffe remained critical, with air cover providing what protection could be mustered against increasingly overwhelming enemy forces. Raeder personally reviewed each operational report, providing guidance to commanders and insisting on disciplined execution despite the bleak strategic circumstances. Morale among sailors was a growing concern. Many had survived years of attrition and constant danger in the Atlantic, North Sea, and Baltic, only to confront a collapsing homeland. Raeder, understanding the importance of leadership in sustaining morale, frequently toured naval bases and spoke with crew members, emphasizing professionalism, duty, and honor. He reminded them that even in the face of inevitable defeat, maintaining discipline and competence was a mark of the Kriegsmarine's enduring legacy. The strategic picture, however, was beyond Raeder's control. Allied forces dominated the Atlantic and North Sea. The U-boat fleet, once the pride of German naval innovation, had been decimated. Raeder recognized that continued offensive operations were futile and began preparing contingency plans for orderly withdrawals, scuttling of ships to prevent capture, and the preservation of personnel. These plans required precision and foresight, qualities Raeder had cultivated over decades, yet the scale of the impending collapse made their execution exceedingly difficult. By mid-1945, Hitler's attention had shifted fully to the defense of Germany's heartland. Raeder found himself increasingly isolated from central command, as political priorities favored the army and Luftwaffe. Nevertheless, he continued to advocate for rational naval operations, emphasizing the strategic necessity of minimizing losses while extracting maximum operational value from remaining assets. His efforts ensured that, even in the final weeks, the Kriegsmarine operated with a degree of coherence and discipline uncommon among collapsing military organizations. Raeder's strategic vision, which had guided the Navy through early campaigns in the Baltic and Atlantic, now became one of preservation. He ordered that remaining U-boats focus on reconnaissance, coastal defense, and evacuation of military and civilian personnel from threatened regions. Surface vessels were reassigned to convoy protection for evacuation ships and limited defensive operations near critical ports. These measures reflected Raeder's understanding that, even in defeat, careful planning could mitigate losses and preserve naval professionalism. The winter months brought severe logistical challenges. Fuel shortages, damaged infrastructure, and Allied air superiority complicated operations across the North Sea and Baltic. Raeder coordinated with remaining naval engineers, logistics officers, and port authorities to prioritize repairs, manage limited fuel reserves, and maintain readiness for essential operations. Despite the deteriorating conditions,
Raeder insisted on adherence to operational discipline, emphasizing that chaos and panic could cause unnecessary casualties and the loss of valuable assets. In parallel, Raeder monitored the broader strategic situation. Intelligence reports indicated that the Allies were rapidly advancing from multiple fronts and German communications were increasingly compromised. He recognized that any further offensive action was impossible, and that the primary focus of the Navy would now be defensive and protective measures. His guidance to commanders stressed caution, precision, and the avoidance of unnecessary engagements. Raeder's decisions reflected both his understanding of operational realities and his commitment to the welfare of his crews. By early 1945, the Kriegsmarine's operational capacity was largely confined to coastal waters and limited convoy escort duties. U-boats were increasingly used for reconnaissance and small-scale interdiction, while surface ships served defensive roles. Raeder's focus on coordination with Army and Luftwaffe units became increasingly critical, particularly as evacuations of civilians and troops from the Eastern Territories intensified. His logistical oversight ensured that these operations were conducted with maximum efficiency under extremely challenging conditions. Despite the overwhelming odds, Raeder's leadership preserved a measure of strategic coherence. Sailors continued to operate under strict discipline, and naval units maintained readiness for critical tasks. Raeder emphasized training, adaptability, and operational precision, ensuring that the Kriegsmarine remained capable of limited effective action even as Germany's overall military position deteriorated. His attention to detail and insistence on professionalism left an enduring legacy, demonstrating the resilience of naval institutions under extreme pressure. The closing months of the Kriegsmarine's operations highlighted the tension between strategic ambition and operational reality. Raeder's early warnings about the limitations of Germany's naval capacity had been validated by the attrition of forces, technological inferiority, and overwhelming enemy production. Yet his disciplined, analytical approach allowed the Navy to continue operating effectively in its limited role. Raeder's focus on preserving personnel, maintaining morale, and optimizing remaining resources ensured that even in defeat, the Kriegsmarine could fulfill essential functions in support of broader military objectives. In April 1945, as Soviet and Western Allied forces closed in on Germany, Raeder issued final operational directives. Submarines were ordered to conduct reconnaissance and limited defensive patrols, surface ships were assigned to evacuation support, and remaining coastal installations were prepared for potential destruction to prevent enemy use. Raeder's meticulous planning underlined his commitment to professional standards and strategic foresight, even in the face of imminent defeat. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 marked the end of the Kriegsmarine's operational existence. Raeder, reflecting on the course of the conflict, recognized the accomplishments and limitations of the Navy he had commanded. Despite being consistently outnumbered and outproduced, the Kriegsmarine had demonstrated remarkable resilience, innovation, and operational skill. Raeder's leadership had preserved the professionalism of the force, ensured tactical successes where possible, and maintained a coherent strategic vision under conditions of extreme adversity.